Minutes right after my divorce was finalized, I called my dad. "Dad, fire all 32 employees my in-laws planted in the company," I said. Thank God I did, because that same evening, my mother-in-law came over yelling, demanding me to hand over half my equity. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to entitled family members who severely underestimated you. My name is Aliyah. I am 32 years old and the Chief Financial Officer of Titan Global Logistics, a highly successful supply chain empire. My father, Isaiah, built from the ground up in Atlanta. We are a proud Black family who believes in hard work and earning your place. My ex-husband, Julian, is a 34-year-old white man who prefers shortcuts and manipulation over actual labor. During our marriage, his mother, Beatrice, a woman dripping with fake suburban elitism, constantly made backhanded remarks about my background while simultaneously demanding I hire her relatives. She framed it as helping out her family, but her true intentions were always toxic. The ink on my divorce decree was not even dry when the real nightmare started. I was standing in the kitchen of my Buckhead home, pouring myself a glass of expensive bourbon to celebrate my new freedom. I held my phone to my ear, listening to my father breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "Dad, the judge just signed the papers," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "It is done. Fire all 32 of them immediately." Before my father could even reply, a loud crash echoed through the house. The heavy custom front door of my home was kicked open, hitting the wall with a sickening thud. I did not even flinch. I just took a slow sip of my bourbon as 3 uninvited guests marched into my foyer like they owned the place. It was Julian, looking as smug and overly groomed as ever. Flanking him were the 2 women who had made my life a living hell for the past 4 years. Beatrice, his wealthy mother, who constantly threw microaggressions at me, and Chloe, his 28-year-old lazy sister who treated my bank account like her personal allowance. Julian did not waste any time. He strutted right up to my marble kitchen island and slammed a massive legal binder down on the counter. The loud slap of the heavy paper echoed in the large room. "We are not done, Aliyah," he said with a greedy smirk playing on his lips. "My new lawyer found a loophole in our prenuptial agreement. Since your father promoted you to Chief Financial Officer and transferred equity to you during our marriage, I am legally entitled to 50% of your shares in Titan Global Logistics." I stared at him, letting the silence stretch. I did not scream or cry or panic. I just looked at this man who had spent our entire marriage pretending to be a supportive partner while secretly siphoning my resources to fund his flashy lifestyle. Before I could respond, Beatrice stepped forward. She was wearing her usual tennis club attire, looking down her nose at me just like she always did. She crossed her arms over her chest and gave me a look of pure malice. "You are going to sign that equity over to Julian today," Beatrice demanded, her voice sharp and grating. "If you refuse to sign those papers right now, I will make one phone call. You know exactly what I am talking about, Aliyah. The 32 loyal, hard-working family members and friends I helped you hire are ready to take action. If you do not give Julian his 50%, they will all walk out. They will strike and paralyze your entire Midwest distribution network right before the peak holiday shipping season. Your father will lose millions, and your precious company will collapse by next week." She looked so proud of herself. For 4 years, Beatrice had played the card of the supportive mother-in-law, pushing me to diversify our staff by hiring her nephew's cousins and country club friends. She used every guilt trip and subtle manipulation tactic in the book to get them placed in comfortable positions within our warehouses. Julian had played the peacemaker, convincing me to just go along with it to keep the family harmony intact. Now they were using those same employees as an army to hold my family legacy hostage. Chloe stepped up next, picking up an expensive decorative bowl from my counter and examining it like she was at a yard sale. "You should just listen to my mother," Chloe chimed in without looking up from the bowl. "Julian is getting this house anyway. You really need to start packing your things, Aliyah. I am going to take the master bedroom. It has the best lighting." They really thought they had me cornered. They thought I was just some naive woman who had lucked into a corporate title because of her father. They thought they could bully their way into my family wealth by holding our supply chain hostage. I took another slow sip of my bourbon, savoring the burn as it went down my throat. I set the glass down on the marble island, carefully making sure it did not make a sound. I looked at Julian, then at Chloe, and finally locked eyes with Beatrice. You think I let 32 parasites suck my family company dry for 4 years without a backup plan? I asked, my voice dangerously low and calm. Beatrice lost her smug smile for a fraction of a second but quickly recovered. She pulled her phone from her designer handbag and held it up for me to see. The screen showed a text message ready to be sent. Go ahead, Beatrice. Beatrice scoffed and tightened her grip on her phone, but she did not press the button just yet. She was too accustomed to having the upper hand to believe I was actually challenging her. You are bluffing, Aaliyah, she said, her voice dripping with that familiar condescension I had endured for years. You always try to act so tough, so unbothered, but we both know you need us. You should be thanking me on your knees right now. My family elevated you. We gave you a level of class and respectability your people could never achieve on your own. I kept my face completely blank, but her words sent a familiar cold rush through my veins. Elevated me. That was the delusion she had been operating under since the day Julian introduced us. I thought back to the very first time I met Beatrice at an overly expensive country club in the suburbs, where I was the only black woman in the dining room. I had just finished explaining how my father and I expanded Titan Global Logistics to cover 14 states, managing thousands of employees. Instead of congratulating me, Beatrice had patted my hand with a look of feigned astonishment. I was so surprised a black-owned business was this organized, she had said loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. It is just so rare to see that kind of structure from your community. You must have had some wonderful white mentors along the way. I had swallowed my anger that night because I loved Julian, or at least the version of Julian he was pretending to be at the time. I thought if I just showed them my worth, they would eventually respect me. But the microaggressions never stopped. They only grew more frequent and more demanding once the wedding ring was on my finger. Beatrice had made it her personal mission to infiltrate my family legacy under the guise of helping us. It started with her brother. I had lost his job, and Beatrice cornered me at a family barbecue, sighing heavily about how hard times were for good, honest folks. You know, Aaliyah, she had said, sipping her iced tea, your company has so much money now. It would be a wonderful gesture of family unity if you gave my brother a regional manager position. It would really help diversify your staff with some good, reliable folks. Diversify. That was the word she used when she wanted to force her underqualified white relatives into senior positions at a black-owned empire. When I hesitated, pointing out that her brother had zero background in logistics, Julian had pulled me aside. He used that soft, manipulative tone he had perfected over the years. Baby, my mom is just trying to bring our families together, he had whispered, stroking my hair. She wants us to be a united front. If you just hire my uncle, it will show her you are truly part of the family. You do not want her to think you are discriminating against us, do you? So I hired him. Then came a cousin who needed a job as a fleet coordinator. Then two nephews who were supposedly brilliant at inventory management but had dropped out of community college. One by one, Beatrice pushed her people into Titan Global Logistics. 32 of them in total over the span of 4 years. Julian always played the peacemaker, framing every hire as a necessary compromise for our marriage. He convinced me that absorbing his family financial burdens was simply what successful people did for their loved ones. He made me feel like setting boundaries was a form of aggression. I watched Julian now, standing in my kitchen, looking like a cornered animal, trying to play the apex predator. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair and shook his head, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh. You are being so hostile and ungrateful right now. Aaliyah, he said, stepping closer to me, but keeping a safe distance from the kitchen island. I do not understand why you always have to make everything a battle. My family sacrificed so much to accept you into our fold. Do you have any idea how hard it was for my mother to defend our marriage to her friends? We looked past your background. We looked past the cultural differences. We opened our arms to you, and this is how you repay us. His gaslighting was almost impressive in its execution. He had lived in the house my father trust paid for. He drove a luxury car leased by my company. He ate food bought with my salary. He wore custom suits funded by my bonuses. Yet he stood there with a straight face claiming his family had sacrificed for me. It was the ultimate display of privilege and delusion. You are holding on to this corporate identity because it is all you have. Julian continued, his voice taking on that fake soothing quality. You are so obsessed with proving you are a strong, independent black woman that you are destroying the only real family you ever had. Just sign the papers, Aliyah. We can do this the easy way. We can still be friends if you just share what is legally mine. I looked at the divorce decree sitting next to my bourbon glass. Legally mine. He really believed the paper he brought meant something. He really believed the 32 employees his mother planted were his personal army. He thought my silence over the last 4 years was submission. He did not realize it was calculation. Beatrice was losing her patience. She stepped around Julian, her face flushed with anger. The veins in her neck were standing out, making her look every bit the aging suburban tyrant she was. I am done playing games with you, you arrogant little girl, Beatrice snapped. She raised her phone higher, making sure I could see the screen clearly. The message was queued up in a group chat containing every single relative she had forced into my distribution centers. I have the text typed out, Beatrice warned, her voice vibrating with malice. All I have to do is press send. You sign the equity over to Julian right now, or Titan Global loses its entire Midwest shipping route in 5 minutes. Do you understand what that means, Aliyah? The holiday rush starts next week. If 32 key managers and coordinators walk off the floor, your distribution network will collapse. Trucks will not leave the loading docks. Inventory will rot in the warehouses. Your clients will cancel their contracts, and your father will lose millions. Your entire legacy will be wiped out because you were too stubborn to give my son what he deserves. She took a deep breath, puffing out her chest. You have 5 seconds to pick up a pen and sign that document. If you do not, I hit send and your company burns to the ground. 5. I took another sip of my bourbon, letting the silence stretch between her, counting. 4. Chloe finally spoke up from the living room, crossing her arms and rolling her eyes. Just sign it, Aliyah, she whined. You are making this so embarrassing for everyone. Just give Julian his half so we can start moving my stuff in. I already told my friends I am getting a house with a pool. 3. Julian leaned against the counter, a smug look returning to his face. Do the smart thing, Aliyah. You are a smart girl. Do not ruin your dad business over your own petty pride. 2. Beatrice moved her thumb directly over the send button. Her eyes were locked onto mine, waiting for me to break. Waiting for the moment I would crumble under the weight of her threat and hand over half of everything I had worked my entire life to build. 1. I did not reach for the pen. I did not look at the legal binder Julian had thrown on the counter. I just looked at Beatrice and gave her a slow, cold smile. The silence in the kitchen was heavy enough to suffocate a normal person, but I felt nothing but absolute clarity. Beatrice kept her thumb hovering over the screen of her phone, her chest heaving with indignant rage. She expected me to drop to my knees and beg for mercy. She expected me to panic and sign away half of my family legacy just to appease her fabricated authority. Instead, I did absolutely nothing. I watched her, realizing that she was not a formidable opponent at all, but just a bitter woman playing a game she did not understand. The intense staring match was suddenly broken by the sound of something scraping against the drywall in the living room. We all turned our heads. Chloe had completely ignored the standoff happening in the kitchen. She behaved as if the entire house already belonged to her, as if my presence was merely a temporary inconvenience she had to tolerate. She hummed a mindless pop song under her breath, completely oblivious to the devastating war her mother was trying to wage just a few feet away. She had wandered over to the far wall of my living room and was standing on her tiptoes, struggling to unhook a large abstract painting from its mount. She grunted softly as she managed to lift the heavy frame off the wall, resting it carelessly against my expensive modern sofa. She dusted off her hands and looked around the room with an expression of profound boredom. Julian is getting this house anyway. Aliyah. So you really need to start packing your things, Chloe said, her voice dragging with that lazy vocal fry she always used. I am going to take the master bedroom upstairs. The natural light in there is much better for my social media posts, and I need the walk-in closet for my new clothes. You can take your stuff out in garbage bags or whatever. I really do not care, just make sure it is all gone by tomorrow morning. I stared at my former sister-in-law, marveling at the sheer audacity of her existence. For 4 years I had funded her entire lifestyle. She had never held down a real job, preferring to float through life on the charity of others, while pretending she was somehow superior to the people working hard around her. Her sense of entitlement was a disease she had inherited directly from Beatrice. I paid her rent when she claimed she was between jobs, which was always. I bought her groceries when she said she was struggling. I even paid off her credit card debt twice because Julian begged me to help his little sister get back on her feet. She had repaid my generosity by walking into my home minutes after my divorce was finalized and claiming my master bedroom as her own. A low chuckle escaped my throat. It started quiet but soon grew into a genuine laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of the living room. Beatrice lowered her phone slightly, her brow furrowing in confusion. Julian shifted his weight, looking nervously between his mother and me. He did not like it when I laughed. He knew from our years in corporate settings that my laughter usually meant someone was about to lose everything. "What is so funny?" Chloe asked, crossing her arms over her chest defensively. "You think losing your house is funny?" I picked up my tablet from the kitchen island and slowly unlocked the screen. I tapped open my secure file directory and navigated to my property documents. I walked around the marble counter and stepped down into the sunken living room, holding the tablet loosely in my hand. I stopped right in front of the painting Chloe had just ripped off my wall. "First of all, Chloe, put down that $50 knockoff canvas," I said, keeping my voice smooth and dangerously calm. "I bought that piece from a discount home goods store when I was in college. If you really want it, you can take it with you when you leave, but please do not scratch my paint job in the process." Chloe flushed red, her eyes darting to Julian for support, but Julian was staring at the tablet in my hand. His confident smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by a tight, tense expression. As for this house, I continued, turning my attention to my ex-husband. I tapped the screen and held the tablet up so Julian could clearly see the legal document displayed on it. "This house is owned by a blind trust my father established 3 years before I even met your brother. My name is not on the deed. Your brother is certainly not on the deed. Julian is not entitled to a single doorknob in this house, let alone the property itself." Julian lunged forward and snatched the legal binder off the kitchen counter. He bumped into the marble island hard enough to rattle his mother phone. His polished, composed facade was cracking rapidly, revealing the desperate, grasping man underneath. He threw the binder open, his hands moving frantically as he flipped through the thick stack of papers his expensive divorce attorney had prepared for him. The sound of tearing paper filled the room as he clumsily searched for the property division section. He was muttering to himself, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon, looking for the loophole his lawyer had promised him. "Your lawyer was sloppy, Julian," I said, taking a step closer to him. "He ran a basic asset search under my personal social security number and saw that I resided here. He saw the property tax payments coming from an account linked to my name and jumped to the most convenient conclusion. He assumed because we lived here together during our marriage that it was a marital asset subject to division. He completely missed the fact that the property is held by the Isaiah Global Real Estate Trust. It is a completely separate legal entity that predates our marriage by several years. You have zero claim to it. You never did." He never bothered to dig deeper into the corporate structures my father and I spent decades perfecting. That laziness was exactly why Julian could never be more than a mid-level grifter wearing an expensive suit. Beatrice stepped forward, her face pale. "That is impossible," she snapped, looking over Julian's shoulder at the binder. "Julian, your lawyer said the house was part of the settlement. He said we could force the sale and take half the equity." "I was wrong, Mom," Julian whispered, his voice barely audible. He stared at the page in his binder where the property details were supposed to be. His hands were actually shaking. "The lawyer missed the trust structure completely. We cannot touch the house." I stood there watching the realization wash over them. They had marched into my home expecting to strip me of my sanctuary, expecting to leave me homeless and humiliated. Instead, they were discovering that their grand master plan was built on amateur legal mistakes and their own greedy assumptions. "You thought you could just walk in here and claim my space?" I asked, my voice echoing in the sudden silence of the room. "You thought you could divide up my life like spoils of war?" But you forgot who you were dealing with. I am the chief financial officer of a logistics empire. I manage hundreds of millions of dollars in international assets every single day. Did you honestly believe I would let a mediocre salesman and his country club mother outsmart me when it came to my own personal wealth? Chloe backed away from the painting, looking suddenly very small. Beatrice was breathing heavily, her eyes darting around the luxurious room, as if realizing for the first time that she would never own any of it. Julian just kept staring at his useless legal binder, the reality of his failure setting in. But I was not done with them yet. The satisfaction of watching their primary target evaporate before their eyes was immense, but it was only the first layer of the trap I had set for them. They had walked into my home with demands and threats, believing their whiteness and their audacity would steamroll my boundaries like they always tried to do in the past. The house was just the beginning of their education. They were about to learn what happens when you try to bite the hand that spent 4 years feeding you. I walked back up to the kitchen island and poured myself another splash of bourbon, taking my time, deliberately making them wait for my next move. The air in the room had shifted completely. The predators had suddenly realized they walked into a cage and I was the one holding the key. The heavy silence in the room was finally broken by the sound of Julian violently kicking the discarded legal papers across the hardwood floor. His face had turned a deep shade of crimson, and the veins in his neck were pulsing with rage. He realized he had been completely outsmarted regarding the house, and his fragile ego simply could not handle the humiliation. He reached into the pocket of his tailored slacks and pulled out his keys, gripping them so tightly his knuckles turned white. He shook the keys at me furiously, the metal jingling loudly in the tense air. "Fine, keep the oversized museum." He spat out, his voice shaking with uncontrolled anger. "I never liked this pretentious house anyway. It is too big, and it feels like a mausoleum. But I am keeping my Porsche, and I am draining every single joint account we share. You think you have won, Aaliyah, but you are wrong. I am going to transfer every dollar we have right now. You will be completely cash poor by tomorrow morning. I will make sure you cannot even afford to buy groceries, let alone pay for the upkeep of this empty mansion." I stood my ground, leaning casually against the cold marble of the kitchen island. I brought my glass of bourbon to my lips, taking a slow, deliberate sip. The warm, amber liquid coated my throat, grounding me in the reality of my absolute victory. I let out a soft breath and looked down at the keys dangling from his trembling fingers. "You mean the silver Porsche Carrera currently parked in my driveway?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously smooth. "The luxury sports car that is leased under the Titan Global Corporate Fleet account. The vehicle that legally belongs to my father and his company." Julian scoffed, rolling his eyes and stepping forward. "That car was a gift," he sneered. "Your father gave it to me when I launched my startup. It is mine, and there is nothing you can do about it." I slowly shook my head, feeling a deep sense of pity for his profound ignorance. "My father does not give $250,000 gifts to parasites," Julian had explained patiently. "He provides company vehicles to senior executives and the spouses of those executives. It is a standard corporate perk. But the moment the judge signed our divorce decree earlier today, you officially ceased to be a spouse. That means you are currently in possession of a corporate vehicle without authorization. In fact, I reported it stolen exactly 10 minutes ago." Beatrice let out a harsh, mocking laugh from the center of the living room. "You are so full of empty threats, Aaliyah," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "You really expect us to believe you called the police on your own husband? You are just trying to scare him because you know he is about to drain your bank accounts. You are bluffing." I did not even have to answer her. As if on cue, the massive floor-to-ceiling windows in my living room were suddenly illuminated by intense flashing lights. Bright red and blue beams bounced off the pristine white walls and reflected across the polished marble floors. The sudden burst of police lights painted the stunned faces of my former in-laws in alternating shades of panic. Julian spun around, his eyes widening in sheer horror. He rushed toward the large front window, stumbling over the edge of the luxury rug in his haste. Chloe and Beatrice hurried right behind him, pressing their faces against the glass to look outside. Through the window, the scene unfolding in my long circular driveway was absolute perfection. Two large police cruisers were parked at steep angles, completely blocking the exit. Their lights were strobing aggressively, cutting through the quiet evening darkness of my upscale Buckhead neighborhood. Behind the cruisers, a heavy-duty tow truck was already backing up toward the gleaming silver Porsche. Two uniformed police officers were standing on my manicured lawn, watching the tow truck operator secure the chains to the front axle of Julian's prized possession. "No," Julian screamed, hitting the glass with his open palms. "No, no, they cannot do this. That is my car." He scrambled away from the window and sprinted toward the front door. He yanked it open and ran out onto the front porch, leaving the door wide open behind him. The cool evening air rushed into the house, carrying the loud mechanical sounds of the tow truck lowering its hoist. I walked slowly toward the open doorway, holding my bourbon glass, wanting a front row seat to his absolute destruction. "Hey, stop! What are you doing?" Julian yelled, running down the front steps, waving his arms frantically. "Turn that off right now. That is my personal vehicle. You are scratching the paint." One of the police officers stepped forward, placing a firm hand on his utility belt. "Sir, I need you to step back onto the porch," the officer commanded with undeniable authority. "We received a report from Titan Global Logistics regarding a stolen corporate asset. The license plate and vehicle identification number perfectly match the stolen report. This vehicle is being impounded." "It is not stolen," Julian pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "I am the son-in-law of the owner. My wife just filed some paperwork incorrectly. Please tell the driver to unhook my car. I have important meetings tomorrow and I need my vehicle." The officer did not budge an inch. "Actually, sir, the paperwork clearly states you are the former son-in-law. The authorized representative of Titan Global Logistics legally reported this vehicle as stolen property. If you interfere with the recovery of this asset, we will place you under arrest for obstruction. Now step back onto the porch immediately." Julian froze, completely paralyzed by the threat of being handcuffed in front of the entire neighborhood. Several doors down, my wealthy neighbors had already stepped out onto their lawns or were peering through their windows, drawn by the flashing police lights. The humiliation radiating from Julian was palpable. He had spent the last 4 years driving that Porsche through these exact streets, revving the engine and pretending he was a self-made millionaire. He had parroted that car around his country club, using it to attract investors for his shady startup. Now all his wealthy neighbors were watching his car get repossessed like a common criminal. Beatrice rushed out onto the porch, standing next to her disgraced son. "Officer, there must be some mistake," she cried out, putting on her best suburban victim voice. "My son is an upstanding citizen. You cannot just come and steal his property in the middle of the night. This is a civil matter." "Ma'am, step back," the second officer warned, shining a flashlight directly into Beatrice's face, making her flinch and cover her eyes. "The tow operator has secured the vehicle. We are done here." We all stood on the porch and watched the heavy chains pull the silver Porsche up onto the flatbed of the tow truck. The grinding sound of the metal gears felt like music to my ears. Julian stood completely still, his shoulders slumped, his entire identity being hauled away into the night. The tow truck secured the load and slowly pulled out of the driveway, followed closely by the 2 police cruisers. The flashing lights faded down the street, plunging my driveway back into quiet darkness. Julian turned around, slowly looking at me with eyes full of pure venom. "You malicious, calculated witch," he hissed, taking a step toward me. "You think taking a car is going to stop me? I still have the joint bank accounts. I am going to empty them right now. I will take every single penny we saved over the last 4 years." He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his fingers flying across the screen as he opened his banking application. He was breathing heavily, desperate for a win, desperate to inflict some kind of pain on me to avenge his bruised ego. I leaned against the doorframe and took another sip of my drink. "You are welcome to check your banking app, Julian," I said softly. "But you will find that the joint accounts are completely empty. I legally withdrew my exact 50% contribution 3 days ago. The only funds remaining in those accounts were the mysterious cash deposits you have been making over the last 6 months. And unfortunately for you, the bank flagged those specific deposits as suspicious. The fraud department froze all your remaining funds early this morning pending a federal investigation." Julian stopped typing. He stared down at his phone screen, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. The error message on his banking app confirmed every word I just said. He had no house, he had no car, he had no access to any cash. He was completely and utterly ruined, and the night was only just beginning. Julian stood frozen, staring at his phone screen, while the reality of his complete financial ruin washed over him. Beatrice, who had been watching her son crumble, finally snapped. She turned away from the window and marched back toward the kitchen island, her face twisted with a level of hatred I had never seen from her before. "You vindictive witch," Beatrice screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You think you can just destroy my son and get away with it? I am going to the press. I am going to call every local news station in Atlanta by tomorrow morning. I will tell them exactly what kind of operation you and your father are running. I will tell them that your black-owned company actively discriminates against and unjustly fires hardworking white employees. I will make sure everyone knows you targeted our family because of your own deep-seated racial bias. Your father spent his whole life building that legacy, and I am going to burn it to the ground." I looked at her flushed face and let her words hang in the air. She really thought she was holding a loaded gun to my head. She thought the threat of a public relations scandal would make me surrender. What Beatrice did not know was that I had been waiting for this exact moment for 4 agonizing years. My mind went back to a humid night 2 years ago. I was sitting alone in my corner office at the Titan Global headquarters, long after everyone else had gone home. The city lights of Atlanta were glowing outside my window, but my focus was entirely on the massive spreadsheets illuminating my monitors. I had been noticing small discrepancies in our Midwest shipping hubs for months. Fuel costs were slightly higher than average. Overtime hours for warehouse coordinators were spiking at unusual intervals. Maintenance requests for trucks that had just been serviced were slipping through the accounting software. I spent weeks meticulously auditing the logistics logs, cross-referencing employee schedules with GPS tracking data from our fleet. That was when I found the pattern. The 32 people Beatrice had bullied me into hiring were not just lazy and incompetent. They were operating a highly organized embezzlement ring right under my nose. Her brother and nephews were creating phantom shipping routes, entering fake deliveries into our system and routing the payments into offshore accounts they had set up under shell corporations. The cousins she had placed in inventory management were marking high-value electronics as damaged or lost, while actually loading them onto unmarked trucks in the middle of the night to be sold on the black market. They were siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from my family company and using the sheer volume of our daily operations to mask their theft. My first instinct that night had been to march into my father's office and demand we fire every single one of them the next morning. I had stormed into his study at our family home, throwing the printed audit reports on his mahogany desk. My father, Isaiah, had put on his reading glasses and carefully reviewed the documents. He did not yell or act surprised. He just looked at me with the calm, calculating demeanor that had made him a self-made millionaire in a world that constantly tried to keep him down. "If we fire them now, they will just claim it was a misunderstanding or an accounting error," my father had said, leaning back in his leather chair. "They will cry discrimination just like that awful mother-in-law of yours always threatens to do. They will use their privilege to play the victims, and the media will eat it up. If you want to eliminate a parasite, you do not just brush it off. You let it feed until it gets so fat it cannot escape the trap." So we made a silent pact that very night. We intentionally kept all 32 of them on the payroll. I continued to approve their fake overtime hours. I signed off on their phantom shipping routes. I watched them buy new cars and take expensive vacations with money they were stealing from my legacy. I let them steal just enough to cross the threshold into major federal crimes. It took immense discipline to sit across from Julian at the dinner table every night knowing his family was actively trying to destroy everything my father had sacrificed to build. I listened to Beatrice brag at her country club luncheons about how her relatives were the only ones keeping my business afloat. I swallowed the bitter taste of their entitlement and focused on the long game. I worked directly with federal investigators, handing over every piece of data they needed to build an airtight case for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and racketeering. The federal agents had been amazed by the meticulous records I provided them. They did not have to investigate much because I had already done the forensic accounting for them. Every stolen pallet of goods was tracked. Every fraudulent wire transfer was traced back to their personal bank accounts. I smiled at family dinners while Julian and Beatrice mocked my long work hours, never realizing I was spending those hours digging their federal graves. Beatrice was still glaring at me, waiting for me to beg her not to call the news stations. "You think the media will care about your little transportation company once I am done with you?" She sneered, taking a step closer to the island. "They love a story about reverse discrimination. You will be toxic, clients will drop you, your father will be ruined, and you will be left with nothing." I set my bourbon glass down on the marble counter, the soft clink breaking the tension in the room. "You should absolutely call the press, Beatrice," I said, my voice perfectly even. "In fact, you might want to call them right now to secure an exclusive interview. But you probably should not tell them a story about racial discrimination. You should tell them you want to make a statement regarding the massive federal indictment that was just unsealed tonight." Beatrice frowned, her confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "What federal indictment?" I reached across the counter and picked up the remote control for the living room television. I pointed it at the massive screen hanging on the wall and pressed the power button. "You have been threatening me with a strike all evening, Beatrice," I said, watching the screen flicker to life. "You said your 32 loyal family members were going to walk off the warehouse floor and paralyze my supply chain. Why do not you go ahead and send that text message right now? Let us see if any of them respond." Beatrice glared at me, her chest heaving with indignation. She raised her phone high so I could see the screen. She pressed her thumb down hard, hitting the send button with unnecessary force. "It is done," she announced, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "Your Midwest hubs are completely shut down, Aaliyah. You just destroyed your father company because you were too arrogant to share." I turned my attention back to the massive television mounted on the wall. The black screen flickered for a second as it paired with my secure laptop network. A high-definition grid of live security camera feeds appeared, illuminating the dark living room. The feeds showed the loading docks and main floors of our three largest distribution centers in Ohio and Illinois and Michigan. Beatrice and Julian stepped closer to the screen, expecting to see their relatives dropping their clipboards and walking out the doors in a dramatic protest. Chloe even stopped crying over the master bedroom long enough to watch the screen. Instead, the warehouses were bathed in the flashing red and blue lights of law enforcement vehicles. The facilities were swarming with federal agents wearing dark windbreakers. The bright yellow letters reading FBI and IRS were clearly visible even on the security cameras. Beatrice let out a sharp gasp as she recognized her brother on the screen. He was the regional manager she had begged me to hire. Now he was being pushed against a concrete loading dock wall with his hands zip-tied behind his back. On another camera feed, two of her nephews were being marched out of the inventory room by armed federal marshals. The warehouse floor was entirely locked down. The workers who actually did their jobs honestly were standing safely to the side, watching the corrupt managers get hauled away in disgrace. Beatrice took a stumbling step backward. Her expensive smartphone slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the solid marble floor with a loud crack. The screen shattered, sending shards of glass across the white tiles. "What is happening?" Beatrice whispered, her voice barely functioning. "What are they doing to my family?" I picked up my bourbon glass and took a relaxed sip. "They are not striking, Beatrice," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "They are being indicted." Julian looked like he was going to vomit. He grabbed the edge of the kitchen island to keep his balance. His eyes darted wildly between the television screen and my face. "You called the FBI on your own employees?" Julian asked, his voice cracking in panic. "I did not just call them, Julian," I explained, setting my drink down. "I practically handed them the entire case wrapped in a neat little bow. I have been auditing the logistics logs for the past 4 years. I found the phantom shipping routes your uncle created. I found the fake invoices your cousins generated. I tracked the missing pallets of high-value electronics that your nephews loaded onto unmarked trucks in the middle of the night. You all thought I was just some clueless diversity hire signing checks in the corporate office. But I am the chief financial officer. I know where every single cent goes." Beatrice was shaking her head back and forth in denial. Her perfectly styled hair was falling out of place, making her look frantic and unhinged. "You cannot do this," she cried out. "We are family. We were just trying to help you run the business. You set them up." "I did not set them up, Beatrice," I said, taking a step closer to her. My father and I knew they were stealing from the very beginning. We just let them upgrade from petty theft to federal wire fraud and corporate racketeering. A loud sob echoed through the living room. Chloe sank to her knees on my expensive rug, clutching her face in her hands. My fiancé, she wailed, rocking back and forth. They are arresting my fiancé. He works at the Illinois warehouse. You sent him to prison, Aaliyah. We were supposed to get married next year. I looked down at Chloe, feeling absolutely no pity. Your fiancé was the ringleader for the Illinois operation, Chloe, I stated coldly. Those bonuses he bragged about were hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars. He used stolen corporate funds to buy your engagement ring and pay for your dream wedding venue. The FBI will be confiscating that diamond as evidence of money laundering, so you might want to take it off before they knock on your door. Your wedding is canceled, and he is facing 20 years in federal prison. Beatrice rushed toward me, grabbing the sleeve of my blouse. You have to stop this, Aaliyah, she begged, her previous arrogance completely shattered. Call the police and tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them it was an accounting error. They are going to lose everything. They will go to federal prison. I calmly pulled my arm out of her grasp, smoothing out the fabric of my shirt. I reached into my leather briefcase sitting on the counter and pulled out a thick stack of printed paper. I dropped the heavy document onto the island, right next to Julian's discarded divorce binder. That is a copy of the federal indictment, I said. You might want to read it, Beatrice. It names all 32 of your relatives. It details every single stolen dollar and every offshore bank account they used. And if you read carefully, you will see your own name listed in the footnotes as an unindicted co-conspirator pending further investigation. Beatrice let out a strangled cry and covered her mouth with her hands. She backed away from the kitchen island, staring at the indictment document as if it were a venomous snake. The reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her. She had spent 4 years playing a dangerous game of corporate espionage, and she had just lost spectacularly. Julian suddenly put his hands up and took 3 large steps away from his mother. He looked at Beatrice with profound disgust, throwing her under the bus without a second thought. This is all her fault, Julian said, pointing a shaking finger at Beatrice. I had nothing to do with the warehouse operations, Aaliyah. You know that. I was focused on my own business. I did not know they were stealing from your father. You cannot blame me for the actions of her family. Beatrice gasped, looking at her son in pure betrayal. Julian, how could you say that, she whimpered. We did this for you. We did this to secure your future. I do not need your help, Mom! Julian shouted, his face turning red. He turned back to me, trying to smooth down his suit jacket and regain some semblance of his former confidence. He forced a strained smile onto his face. You know what, Aaliyah, keep the house. Keep the corporate cars. I do not care. I do not need your money or your father logistics company anyway. I looked at Julian standing there basking in the delusion of his own success. He actually believed he had an escape route. He thought he could walk out of my house untouched and live the life of a wealthy tech founder. He thought his hands were clean. I let out a low, amused breath and picked up my bourbon glass once more. The final piece of the trap was ready to be sprung. I took a slow step around the kitchen island. My heels clicked against the marble floor, breaking the heavy silence. Beatrice was staring at the federal document. Her face was drained of color. Chloe was sobbing on the floor, clutching her phone, hoping her fiancé would call. I looked down at the thick stack of papers that represented 4 years of my silent suffering and meticulous planning. You thought I was just some clueless woman who inherited a title, I said. You mistook my professionalism for stupidity, Beatrice. From the first week your brother started working at the Ohio distribution center, I knew something was wrong. He thought because he had the backing of the owner's son-in-law, he did not have to cover his tracks. I walked over to the television and paused the live security feed. The screen froze on an image of her brother being pushed into the back of a federal vehicle. I tapped my tablet and brought up a complex spreadsheet displaying thousands of highlighted transactions. This is what I have been doing every night while you and Julian were attending expensive galas. I explained, gesturing to the data. I tracked every single fake invoice your family generated. I watched them create phantom shipping routes to non-existent warehouses in the Midwest. I monitored every stolen pallet of high-value merchandise they diverted to the black market. Your nephews marked entire shipments of commercial electronics as damaged goods. Then they loaded those electronics onto unmarked trucks and sold them. Chloe let out a loud gasp, her cries echoing loudly. But my fiancé, she wailed, her makeup running down her face. He did not steal anything. He told me he was saving up his bonuses for our wedding. He told me he was doing so well at your company, Aaliyah. Your fiancé was the ringleader for the Illinois operation, Chloe, I stated coldly. He was the one approving the fake overtime hours for the rest of your family members. He authorized payments to shell companies that did not exist. Those bonuses he bragged about were hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars. He used my family money to buy your engagement ring and pay for your dream wedding venue. Your wedding is canceled, Chloe, and your fiancé is facing 20 years in federal prison. Chloe buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Beatrice pointed a shaking finger at me. You are a monster, Beatrice whispered. You could have just fired them. You could have stopped this years ago. You let them ruin their lives just to punish me. I took another sip of my bourbon. They ruined their own lives because of their insatiable greed, I said. If I had fired them 2 years ago, you would have run straight to the media. You would have claimed I was a racist boss targeting your innocent white relatives. You would have tried to sue us for wrongful termination. I knew exactly what kind of manipulative game you would play, so my father and I made a calculated business decision. I continued, my tone devoid of any empathy. We decided that petty theft was not enough to put you away for good. We needed an airtight case. We let your family cross the legal threshold into major federal wire fraud and interstate racketeering. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service have been building this case for 18 months, based entirely on the forensic accounting I provided them. Beatrice stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the sofa. She looked completely broken, her aristocratic facade entirely stripped away. She realized she had delivered her entire extended family straight into a federal penitentiary. The 32 people she had bullied me into hiring were now facing decades behind bars because of her overwhelming arrogance. I picked up the physical copy of the federal indictment from the kitchen island and walked over to where Beatrice was standing. Take it, I commanded. Read the names, Beatrice. Read the 52 counts of wire fraud. Read the 20 counts of money laundering. Read the exact amount of restitution your family owes my company. It comes out to just over $4 million. Beatrice reached out with a trembling hand and took the stack of papers. She stared at the front page where the seal of the United States District Court was printed in bold black ink. Her eyes scanned the list of defendants and she let out a quiet, choked sob as she saw her brother's name followed by her nephews and cousins. But then her breath hitched in her throat. Why is my name on this? Beatrice asked, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. I did not work at the warehouses. I did not steal anything. I just asked you to hire them. You cannot do this to me. I smiled, letting the cold reality of her situation settle over her. You may not have loaded the stolen goods onto the trucks, Beatrice said smoothly. But you certainly enjoyed the profits. Did you think I would not trace the kickbacks? Did you think I would not find the offshore accounts your brother used to wire you your cut of the money? The FBI has all your bank records. They know you orchestrated the hiring of every single person involved in the theft ring. That makes you the primary architect of a federal conspiracy. Beatrice dropped the indictment papers. The thick stack of paper hit the hardwood floor, scattering across the rug. She looked at Julian, desperately seeking a lifeline. Julian, do something, she pleaded, tears spilling down her cheeks. She is trying to send me to prison. Tell her to stop this right now. Tell your wife to drop these charges. Julian backed away from his mother, holding his hands up defensively. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting toward the front door. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with the sinking ship that was his family. The final piece of the trap was ready to be sprung. Julian ran a hand over his face, wiping away the beads of sweat that had formed on his forehead. He looked at Beatrice with an expression of pure contempt, as if she were a stranger he had never met. That is on them, Julian said, his voice rising in panic. I had absolutely nothing to do with the warehouses or the shipping routes, Aaliyah. You know that. I am completely innocent in all of this. Beatrice reached out for him, but Julian took another large step backward, bumping into the luxury sofa. Do not touch me, Mom, he snapped. I am not going down for your ridiculous greed. I have my own life and my own business to worry about. He turned back to me, trying to stand tall and project the false confidence that had fooled me years ago. He smoothed down the lapels of his expensive suit and took a deep breath. I do not need your money anymore, Aaliyah, he stated, trying to sound authoritative. I do not need your father, and I certainly do not need his outdated logistics company. I have my own tech startup, Logitrack. We are launching our new software next month, and the initial valuation is already worth millions. I am walking away from this toxic family drama and taking my success with me. I watched him puff out his chest, trying to reclaim some sense of power in a room where he had just lost everything. Logitrack. The very name of his startup made me want to laugh out loud. For the past 2 years, Julian had made it his personal mission to belittle everything my father and I had built. He hated that my family held the real wealth, while he only had an allowance. I remembered a dinner party we hosted last summer for several prominent Black business owners in Atlanta. My father had invited colleagues who had spent decades building their enterprises through sweat and sacrifice. Julian had spent the entire evening dominating the conversation, making sure everyone knew he was a tech founder. He wore a turtleneck and a blazer, pretending he was the next Silicon Valley visionary. He had stood in my dining room holding a glass of expensive wine, telling my father that traditional trucking was a dying industry. You guys are running an old-school truck business, Julian had bragged that night, holding his glass high. It is blue-collar work. It is outdated. The real wealth is in data and automation. My startup Logitrack is going to disrupt the entire supply chain sector. We are building algorithms that will make physical warehouses obsolete. You should probably sell your trucks now before my software puts you out of business, Isaiah. My father had just smiled politely and eaten his steak while I clenched my fists under the table. My father knew Julian was a fool, but he also knew my plan was already in motion. Julian loved to pretend he was a genius. Whenever I asked him how his startup was making payroll since they had zero actual clients and zero revenue, he would wave his hand dismissively. He claimed he had secured a massive angel investor who believed in his vision and did not require immediate returns. He told everyone at our country club that his mother, Beatrice, had liquidated her personal stock portfolio to provide the initial seed money for his brilliant tech venture. I used that startup to make himself feel superior to me. He used it to justify why he never contributed to our mortgage or paid for our vacations. He told me he was building a legacy, he would say, so I needed to be the supportive wife and handle the mundane bills while he focused on changing the world. It was a convenient excuse to live like a king while contributing absolutely nothing to our household. Now he stood in my living room, using that same startup as a shield against the federal crimes his family had committed. He honestly believed his tech company was a safe haven, untouched by the mess his mother had created. He thought he could just wash his hands of Beatrice and Chloe and drive away into the sunset as a wealthy tech CEO. His delusion was almost breathtaking. I set my bourbon glass down on the marble island for the last time. Julian was so caught up in his own ego that he did not even realize how interconnected his life was with the very crimes he was trying to run away from. He thought his hands were clean because he had not personally loaded stolen electronics onto a truck. He did not understand how federal forensic accounting actually worked, and he certainly did not understand how meticulously I had tracked every single moving part of his life. You think your startup is your escape route, Julian, I asked, letting out a soft sigh. You really think you can just distance yourself from your mother and walk out my front door a free man? I am a free man, Julian insisted, crossing his arms defensively. My business is completely separate from Titan Global. You have no legal claim to my company, Aaliyah. The divorce decree clearly states that Logitrack remains my sole property. My lawyer made sure of that. You cannot touch it. My investors are protected and my intellectual property is locked down tight. Chloe, who was still crying on the floor, sniffled and looked up at her brother. Julian, please do not leave us, she pleaded, her voice trembling with genuine fear. The FBI is going to take Mom away. You have to help us pay for lawyers. You said your company was worth millions. You promised we would all be rich when the software launched. Julian did not even look down at his sister. I am not ruining my reputation to defend criminals, Chloe, he said coldly, taking another step toward the front door. My investors would pull out immediately if my name was tied to a federal wire fraud case. I have to protect Logitrack. It is the only thing that matters right now. I will send you some money for a public defender once my launch is complete, but I cannot be associated with you or Mom right now. The sheer arrogance of his statement was the perfect segue into his total destruction. He was willing to throw his own mother and sister to the federal government to save a company that I knew for a fact was built entirely on stolen money. I reached into the leather briefcase one more time and pulled out a slim blue folder. This folder did not have the seal of a federal court on it, but its contents were just as devastating. You are right, Julian, I said, tapping the blue folder against the marble counter. You did not work in the warehouses. You did not alter the shipping routes. You just sat in your expensive leased office in downtown Atlanta and played CEO. But you have a very severe misunderstanding of where your seed money actually came from. Julian frowned, his arms slowly dropping to his sides. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice losing its confident edge. My mother invested in my company. She sold her stocks. It was perfectly clean money. I have the bank transfer receipts to prove it. I looked at Beatrice, who was still staring blankly at the federal indictment on the floor. Her hands were shaking violently now because she knew exactly what I was about to reveal. She knew the walls were finally closing in on her precious son. Beatrice did not sell any stocks to fund your startup, Julian. I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet room. Beatrice does not have any stocks. Beatrice has not had any real wealth since her husband died 15 years ago. I walked around the island and held the blue folder out toward Julian. He hesitated before it, his fingers shaking slightly as they brushed against mine. Open it, Julian, I commanded. Let us take a detailed look at who really funded your brilliant tech empire. Julian reached out and took the blue folder from my hands. His fingers were trembling so badly he could barely grip the heavy cardstock. He flipped open the cover and stared at the top page. It was a certified financial tracing report stamped by our forensic accounting firm. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the highlighted columns of numbers. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing in his throat, but he did not speak. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool marble of the kitchen island. Where did you think your mother got $1.5 million in cash, Julian? I asked, keeping my voice low and steady. Did you honestly believe she was sitting on a secret fortune? Beatrice has not worked a day in her life since your father passed away 15 years ago. She has been living entirely on credit and maintaining a fake country club lifestyle to impress people who do not even like her. Julian looked up from the folder. His face was a mask of pure confusion. He looked at Beatrice, who was still sitting on the edge of the sofa with her head buried in her hands. She could not even bring herself to make eye contact with her golden child. I pointed to the second page in the folder. That angel investment was nothing more than dirty money, Julian, I explained. It was a direct kickback from the 32 parasites your mother planted in my warehouses. For every fake shipping route they created, and for every pallet of stolen electronics they sold, they wired a percentage of the profits directly to offshore accounts controlled by Beatrice. She took the money they stole from my black family, and she washed it through a dummy corporation. Then she handed it to you wrapped in a pretty bow and called it an angel investment for your brilliant tech venture. Julian stumbled backward, shaking his head frantically. No, he whispered, his voice breaking. No, that is not true. My mother sold her mutual funds. She told me she liquidated her retirement accounts for me. I let out a harsh laugh. Your mother does not have a retirement account, Julian. The only thing she had was an endless supply of stolen cash courtesy of my father logistics empire. Your entire startup was funded by the sweat and blood of Titan Global employees. You did not build anything. You just played CEO with money your family embezzled from me. Julian turned toward his mother. His chest was heaving and his eyes were wide with panic. Mom, tell me she is lying. Julian begged, his voice echoing in the large living room. Tell me you did not use stolen money. Tell me my company is clean. Beatrice just sobbed louder, her shoulders shaking as she remained curled up on the sofa. She could not formulate a single word of defense because the undeniable truth was sitting right there in the blue folder. Chloe was crying too, realizing that the wealth she had always taken for granted was nothing but a criminal illusion. Julian turned back to me, dropping the blue folder onto the kitchen island as if it were on fire. Okay, fine, he stammered, wiping the sweat from his forehead. Fine, my mother is a criminal. But I did not know, Aliyah. I had no idea the seed money was stolen. I am an innocent party in this. Logitrack is still my company. I built the software. I hired the developers. You cannot take my startup away from me just because my mother lied about where the initial investment came from. I looked at him, marveling at how a man so completely broken could still cling to his unwarranted arrogance. He truly believed he could just walk away from the wreckage his family caused and keep the prize. I reached into my briefcase one last time. I pulled out a heavy document bound with a black legal clip. I set it down gently next to the blue folder. I suggest you brush up on basic corporate law, Julian. I said, my tone dropping to a deadly serious register. Because the foundational seed money for Logitrack was stolen directly from Titan Global Logistics, the federal government and the civil courts view your startup as the product of stolen corporate assets. Titan Global is the primary victim of this theft. Therefore, Titan Global legally owns every single thing purchased with that stolen money. Julian stared at the new document, but he did not reach for it. He looked like he was going to be sick. My father and our corporate attorneys spent the entire afternoon at the federal courthouse. I continued, making sure every word landed like a physical blow. We presented the forensic accounting reports to a federal judge. The judge signed an immediate asset seizure order. Because your company was built on the foundation of our stolen millions, Titan Global now legally owns all the intellectual property, the algorithms, the office leases, and the equity of Logitrack. Your tech startup does not belong to you, Julian. It belongs to my father and me. You cannot do that, Julian yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria. You cannot just take my company. I have investors. I have contracts. You do not have anything, Julian, I stated flatly. I am the chief financial officer of the company that now owns your entire existence. And about an hour before you kicked my front door open, I signed the corporate paperwork officially liquidating Logitrack to recoup our stolen funds. The servers have already been shut down. The office lease has been terminated. The bank accounts have been seized by the federal authorities. Your brilliant tech startup is dead. It is completely gone. Julian's legs gave out. He collapsed onto one of the bar stools at the kitchen island, staring blankly at the marble countertop. He had walked into my home expecting to take half of my generational wealth. Now he was sitting in my kitchen, stripped of his car, his bank accounts, and his entire professional identity. You are officially bankrupt, Julian, I said, delivering the final devastating blow. You have no money. You have no job. You have no company. You are nothing but a disgraced grifter who got caught trying to steal from a black woman who is 10 times smarter than you will ever be. Julian buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, agonizing groan that sounded like a dying animal. The facade was completely gone. The handsome, confident tech founder was dead, and all that remained was a pathetic, broken man realizing he had absolutely nothing left to his name. I picked up my glass of bourbon and took a slow, satisfying sip. The taste of victory had never been sweeter. But as I watched Beatrice sobbing on the sofa and Julian hyperventilating at my kitchen counter, I knew the night was far from over. Beatrice still thought she had one last card to play. She still thought her white suburban privilege would somehow save her from the ultimate ruin. She was about to find out just how wrong she was. Beatrice watched her son crumble onto the bar stool, and something inside her finally snapped. She could not accept that a black woman from a family she viewed as beneath her had utterly dismantled her entire bloodline. She pushed herself up from the luxury sofa, smoothing down her designer skirt with shaking hands. She lifted her chin, trying to summon the generations of unearned privilege that had always protected her in the past. You think you have won, Alia, Beatrice sneered, her voice trembling but full of venom. You think taking a fake tech company makes you powerful. You are nothing but new money. Your father drove trucks for a living while my family was establishing the foundations of this city. You can take Julian's startup, but you cannot touch my real wealth. I come from old money. My family generational wealth is locked away in assets you could not even begin to comprehend. I set my bourbon glass down and looked at her. Her desperation was almost palpable. She was clinging to the ghost of her social status, because it was the only weapon she had left. My estate has been in our family for 3 generations, Beatrice bragged, taking a step toward the kitchen island. That historical suburban mansion is untouchable. It is a landmark. I have millions tied up in real estate and antique assets that your corporate lawyers cannot even touch. You might have ruined my son today, but tomorrow morning, I will hire the best defense attorneys in the state of Georgia. I will use my old money to crush your pathetic logistics company in civil court. I will sue you for everything you have, and I will make sure you are the one left with nothing. I let her finish her rant. I let her stand there in my kitchen, basking in the delusion of her untouchable white wealth. She truly believed that the sprawling mansion she lived in was an impenetrable fortress. She thought her country club memberships and her historical society connections made her immune to the consequences of her own actions. I picked up my tablet from the counter and woke up the screen. The bright glow illuminated my face as I pulled up a highly classified banking document. I turned the screen slightly so the light caught Beatrice's eye. "Old money," I asked, my voice dripping with quiet amusement. "Is that what we are calling it these days, Beatrice? Because true old money does not usually require high-interest commercial loans to keep up appearances." Beatrice froze, her mouth opening slightly. She stared at the back of my tablet. "You see, Beatrice, $1.5 million in stolen seed money runs out very quickly when your son is leasing penthouse offices and hosting catered launch parties for a software that does not even exist," I explained patiently. Julian burned through that initial investment in less than a year. He needed more capital to keep up his fake CEO lifestyle. He went to a commercial bank to secure a $2 million business loan for Logitrack. But since his startup had zero revenue, the bank required a guarantor with significant collateral. I tapped the screen of my tablet, bringing up a digital copy of a heavily notarized contract. "Do you remember signing a massive stack of paperwork for Julian about 8 months ago, Beatrice?" I asked. "He probably told you it was just standard procedure for early investors. He probably told you it was a mere formality to help him bridge the gap before his software launched." Julian kept his head buried in his hands, but his shoulders tensed. Beatrice's face went completely blank. Her eyes darted from me to her son and back to me. "What did you do, Julian?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I did exactly what a parasite does, Beatrice," I said. He drained his host. To secure that $2 million commercial loan, Julian needed a hard asset. You used your generational estate as collateral. You put a lien on your historical suburban mansion to secure the remaining business loans for Logitrack. You leveraged your entire family history to the absolute hilt just to fund his ego. Beatrice shook her head violently. "No, that is impossible," she cried out. "The bank said my house was safe. They said it was just a backup measure. Julian promised me the company would pay off the loan before the end of the year. You cannot touch my house. It is protected by a trust." I let out a soft laugh. "It was protected by a trust right up until you signed it away as collateral for a commercial business loan," I corrected her. "And here's where your old money privilege truly reaches its dead end. When a company defaults on a secured loan, the debt does not just disappear, it gets sold or absorbed. When I officially liquidated Logitrack this evening, Titan Global Logistics absorbed all of its assets and all of its liabilities." I swiped to the next document on my tablet. It was a digital transfer of deed accompanied by a notice of default. "Titan Global now owns the debt of Logitrack," I stated clearly, making sure every single word echoed in the quiet room. "Which means Titan Global now owns the lien on your historical estate, Beatrice. Your generational wealth is currently sitting on the balance sheet of a black-owned logistics company." Beatrice let out a high-pitched gasp, clutching her chest as if she could physically feel her heart stopping. Chloe, who had been listening from the floor, looked up in sheer terror. "Mom, what does she mean?" Chloe asked, her voice shaking. "What does she mean she owns our house?" "It means you are officially squatters, Chloe," I said, looking down at her. I turned my attention back to my tablet. My finger hovered over a large green button on the screen. This button was connected directly to my legal team automated filing system. "You threatened to paralyze my supply chain today, Beatrice," I said, locking eyes with my former mother-in-law. "You threatened to ruin my father's legacy. You thought your suburban mansion made you a queen. But queens do not gamble away their castles to fund their idiot sons." "No, Alia, please," Beatrice begged, her voice dropping into a desperate, pathetic whine. "Please do not do this. It is my family home. It is all I have left. I have lived there for 40 years. My friends are in that neighborhood. Where will I go?" You should have thought about that before you stole from my family, I said coldly. I pressed my finger down on the green button. The screen flashed, confirming the action. I just initiated the foreclosure process live on the county server, I announced, setting the tablet down on the island. The eviction notices are being printed as we speak. The local sheriff's department will be arriving at your historical estate by the end of the week to change the locks and board up the windows. You have exactly 5 days to pack whatever fake designer clothes you have left and get out of my property. Beatrice let out a guttural scream. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the floor right next to Chloe. The two women sat on my expensive rug, weeping uncontrollably, as the reality of their absolute destitution finally set in. They had walked into my home expecting to steal my fortune, and now they did not even have a bed to sleep in. Julian finally lifted his head from his hands. His face was stained with tears and his eyes were completely hollow. He looked around the kitchen, staring at the ruined lives of his mother and sister. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic croak came out of his throat. He realized there was no charm left to save him. There were no more lies he could spin. But the absolute worst part of his night was still waiting just outside my front door. The heavy silence in the living room was broken only by the sound of Beatrice weeping on the floor. Julian slowly stood up from the bar stool. He ran both hands through his hair, taking a deep, shaky breath. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was a survivor in the worst sense of the word. Even after watching his mother lose her generational home and realizing his startup was completely liquidated, Julian still thought he could manipulate his way out of the corner. He walked around the kitchen island, stepping carefully over the scattered pages of the federal indictment. He stopped a few feet away from me. He forced his facial muscles to relax and put on that soft, pleading expression he had used to deceive me for so many years. "Alia, baby, listen to me," Julian said, his voice dropping into a gentle, comforting register. "We can fix this. I know you are angry, and I know you are hurt because of the divorce. You are lashing out because you feel betrayed and you want to punish me. I understand that. I really do. But you are going too far. You are letting your emotions cloud your better judgment. We do not have to destroy each other. We built a life together, and we still care about each other deep down. We can sit down like adults and talk this through. Let us just wait for my lawyers to get here. We can negotiate a settlement that works for everyone." I stared at him in absolute disbelief. The sheer audacity of this man was almost impressive. He was standing in a house paid for by my family legacy, wearing clothes bought with my money after trying to extort half of my equity, and he was telling me I was just being emotional. I was trying to gaslight me into thinking my calculated destruction of his criminal enterprise was just a hysterical reaction to a broken marriage. I thought if he spoke to me like a wounded child, I would suddenly forget the 4 years of theft and microaggressions. He wanted to frame my brilliant financial strategy as the irrational outburst of a bitter black woman who could not handle a breakup. "I am not hurt, Julian," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I am efficient. There is nothing left to negotiate. You have no assets. Your mother has no home. Your sister has no fiancé. Your lawyers cannot save you from the reality of your own actions." Julian shook his head, a condescending smile touching the corners of his mouth. "You always were too stubborn for your own good, Aaliyah," he sighed, crossing his arms over his chest. "You think you hold all the cards because you played a few corporate tricks tonight, but my legal team is the best in Atlanta. They know how to handle these complex asset disputes. They will tear your forensic accounting apart in civil court. We will tie you up in litigation for the next decade, and your father will spend millions just trying to defend his logistics company. You are going to lose in the end, so you might as well surrender now." Just as Julian finished his empty threat, the sharp chime of my front doorbell echoed through the house. Julian's posture instantly transformed. The pathetic, pleading husband vanished, and the arrogant, entitled grifter returned in full force. His chest puffed out and his smug smirk widened into a triumphant grin. He looked at me with pure satisfaction, certain that his expensive legal cavalry had finally arrived to put me back in my place. "That will be my attorney," Julian announced, straightening his suit jacket and adjusting his cuffs. He promised he would meet me here to finalize the equity transfer. "Your little power trip is officially over, Aaliyah. You had your fun scaring my mother and sister with those fake foreclosure documents, but now the real adults are going to talk." My lawyer is going to walk in here and explain exactly why you cannot just seize a tech company without due process. You are about to learn a very hard lesson about how the real world works. Julian turned his back on me and strode confidently toward the foyer. Beatrice and Chloe looked up from the rug, a glimmer of desperate hope returning to their tear-stained faces. Beatrice wiped her eyes and sniffled, watching her son march toward the front door. They truly thought the wealthy white savior in a tailored suit had arrived to rescue them from the consequences they so deeply deserved. They thought their privilege was stepping through the door to save their generational wealth. I did not move from the kitchen island. I just crossed my arms and waited. I knew exactly who was standing on the other side of that custom mahogany door. I had been coordinating with the authorities all afternoon to ensure the timing of this entire evening was flawlessly executed. Julian grabbed the heavy brass handle and pulled the front door wide open, expecting to greet his high-priced divorce attorney. "Good evening, gentlemen," Julian started to say, putting on his best corporate voice. The words died in his throat. Standing on my front porch was not a team of expensive civil lawyers carrying briefcases. It was Detective Rollins from the Financial Crimes Unit. He was a tall, imposing man with a stern expression and a gold star badge clipped to his belt. Standing directly behind him were two uniformed police officers, their hands resting comfortably near their utility belts. The red and blue lights from their parked cruisers were flashing against the expensive brick facade of my house, illuminating Julian's pale, terrified face. Julian took a sudden step backward, his confident smirk instantly evaporating into thin air. He looked at the police officers in sheer panic, his eyes darting wildly as if searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. "Julian Jackson," Detective Rollins asked, his voice booming across the spacious foyer. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He just nodded slowly, his entire body trembling as he stared at the handcuffs clipped to the officer belt. Beatrice let out a horrified gasp from the living room. She scrambled to her feet, abandoning Chloe on the floor, and rushed toward the foyer. "What is the meaning of this?" Beatrice demanded, her shrill voice cutting through the tension. "Who are you, and why are you at my daughter-in-law house? My son has a top-tier legal team coming. You have no right to be here." Detective Rollins ignored Beatrice completely. He kept his eyes locked firmly on Julian. The detective stepped over the threshold and into my home, pulling a folded legal document from the inside pocket of his jacket. "Julian Jackson," Detective Rollins stated loudly and clearly, so everyone in the house could hear. "I have the warrant for your arrest issued by the federal court. You are being charged with conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, receiving stolen federal funds, and multiple counts of wire fraud in connection with the Logi-Track investigation." Julian's knees buckled. If one of the uniformed officers had not stepped forward to grab his arm, he would have collapsed onto the hardwood floor. The reality of his situation had finally arrived, and it was not wearing a tailored suit to negotiate a settlement. It was wearing a badge and carrying handcuffs ready to take everything away from him. Julian stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the edge of the open door frame. He shook his head back and forth, his perfectly styled hair now completely ruined and matted with sweat. "There must be some kind of mistake," Julian stammered, holding his hands up as if he could physically push the federal charges away. "I am a tech founder. I run Logitrack. I do not have anything to do with warehouse operations. You want my mother. She is the one who hired them. She is the one who took the money." Beatrice let out a high-pitched shriek from the center of the foyer. She could not believe her golden child was throwing her to the authorities without a second of hesitation. But the detective did not even look in her direction. "Julian Jackson, you have the right to remain silent." Detective Rollins began, his voice completely devoid of sympathy, as he stepped forward and grabbed Julian by the arm. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The two uniformed officers moved in immediately, grabbing Julian's other arm and twisting him around so his chest hit the heavy custom door. The sound of the metal handcuffs clicking shut echoed loudly in the quiet entryway. It was the sharp, crisp sound of absolute finality. Chloe started screaming. She fell to her knees on my expensive rug, covering her ears as if trying to block out the reality of what was happening. "Julian, please tell them you did not do it," Chloe wailed, her voice cracking. "Tell them it is a mistake, Julian. We are supposed to be rich. We are supposed to get the house. Beatrice suddenly snapped out of her state of shock. The wealthy suburban entitlement that had protected her for 62 years flared up in a desperate, blinding rage. She charged toward the front door, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. She physically threw herself between Detective Rollins and the open doorway, blocking their path to the police cruisers outside. "Take your hands off my son right now," Beatrice demanded, pointing her finger directly in the detective's face. "Do you have any idea who we are? We are the Jackson family. My late husband built the historical society in this county. I know the mayor. I know the chief of police. You cannot just walk into a house in Buckhead and arrest a white man without speaking to his legal counsel first. I will have your badge for this. I will sue this entire department into bankruptcy." Detective Rollins did not even blink. He looked down at Beatrice with a gaze so cold it could have frozen water. "Ma'am, step aside right now," Detective Rollins warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "Your son is being indicted on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy to commit corporate espionage and receiving stolen federal funds. If you do not move out of this doorway in the next 3 seconds, I will personally arrest you for obstruction of justice and interfering with a federal investigation. And since your name is heavily featured in the forensic accounting reports we just received, I suggest you tread very carefully." The threat of her own arrest finally pierced through Beatrice's delusion. She gasped and took a stumbling step backward, pressing her back against the wall of the foyer. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She watched helplessly as the two uniformed officers shoved Julian forward, forcing him to walk out the front door. I walked slowly from the kitchen into the foyer, leaning against the archway, to watch the grand finale. Julian looked over his shoulder as the officers dragged him down the front steps. His face was pale and slick with tears. He looked at me with eyes full of pure, unfiltered terror. "Aaliyah, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking as he stumbled over the concrete pathway. "Aaliyah, please help me. Tell them it was a corporate misunderstanding. I am your husband. We were supposed to build a life together. Please do not let them take me away." I just stood there with my arms crossed, staring back at him. "I am not your wife, Julian," I said, my voice carrying easily through the cool evening air. "I am the chief financial officer of Titan Global Logistics, and you are just a liability," we finally wrote off. The officers pushed Julian toward the back of the waiting police cruiser. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the entire street, drawing the attention of every wealthy neighbor in my exclusive subdivision. Doors were opening all up and down the block. People in silk bathrobes and cashmere sweaters were stepping out onto their manicured lawns, holding glasses of wine as they watched the spectacle unfold. They watched Julian, the man who had spent 4 years bragging at neighborhood association meetings about his fake tech empire, being shoved into the back of a squad car like a common criminal. He had wanted so badly to belong to this world of extreme wealth and luxury. Now the very people he had tried so hard to impress were watching his ultimate humiliation. They saw him crying and begging as the officer pushed his head down and forced him into the back seat. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off his pathetic pleas for help. Beatrice slid slowly down the wall of my foyer until she was sitting on the floor. Her hands were tangled in her hair and she was rocking back and forth, muttering to herself. She had lost her son. She had lost her generational mansion. She had lost the stolen millions she thought would secure her fake upper-class lifestyle forever. Chloe was still sobbing in the living room, completely paralyzed by the realization that her life of leeching off my bank accounts was permanently over. She had no job skills, no education, and no fiancé to bail her out. The lead cruiser pulled away from the curb, its sirens wailing as it carried Julian off to federal holding. The second cruiser lingered for a moment while Detective Rollins walked back up my driveway. He stopped at the front porch and looked at me, giving a short, respectful nod. "We will be in touch regarding the formal statements," Ms. Aaliyah, Detective Rollins said. "Your forensic accounting made our job very easy today. The Bureau appreciates your cooperation." "Just doing my job, Detective," I replied, offering him a polite nod in return. "Have a safe drive back downtown." He turned and walked back to his vehicle, leaving me alone in the doorway with the two weeping women who had tried to steal my family legacy. The cool night breeze swept through the open door, clearing out the stifling energy they had brought into my home. I looked down at Beatrice, who was staring at the empty driveway where the police cars had just been. She looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot and swollen. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure hatred and bottomless despair. "You planned this perfectly," Beatrice whispered, her voice raspy from crying. "You waited until the divorce was final. You waited until Julian felt safe. You destroyed us on purpose." "I did not destroy you, Beatrice," I said, stepping back inside and preparing to close the heavy wooden door. "I just handed you the bill for the lifestyle you could not afford. Now get up and get out of my house before I have you arrested for trespassing too." The heavy wooden door did not even have a chance to swing shut. Before I could push it closed, Beatrice threw herself forward. She collapsed onto her knees right on the threshold, blocking the door from closing. The polished, confident white suburban matriarch was completely gone. In her place was a broken, weeping woman, whose entire world had just been loaded into the back of a police cruiser. "Alia, please," Beatrice sobbed, grabbing the hem of my dress with her trembling hands. "Please do not do this to us. I am begging you. Drop the charges against Julian. You have the power to stop this investigation. You can tell the federal agents it was all a big corporate misunderstanding. He is your husband. He is the man you loved." I looked down at her hands clutching my clothes. I did not move away. I just stared at her fingers until she realized what she was doing and slowly let go. Her hands fell to her sides and she slumped forward, pressing her face toward the floor. "I cannot lose my house, Alia." Beatrice wept her tears, leaving dark, wet spots on the hardwood. "I will do whatever you want. I will leave the city. I will never speak to you again. Just please call your father and tell him to release the lien on my estate. We are family, Alia. We are both women. We understand how hard it is to protect what is ours. We are supposed to lift each other up. You cannot just throw your own mother-in-law out onto the street." The sheer audacity of her playing the feminist solidarity card was almost laughable. For 4 years, this woman had actively tried to tear me down. She had smiled in my face at family dinners while secretly draining my bank accounts to fund her son. She had brought her mediocre relatives into my father company, demanding I give them six-figure salaries while she mocked my background. She had spent years trying to make me feel small in my own home. Now that she was the one on the floor, she suddenly wanted to talk about sisterhood. I stepped back, making sure there was a clear physical distance between her groveling form and my space. "We are not family. Beatrice," I stated, my voice perfectly level and cold. "We were never family. You made sure of that from the very beginning." Beatrice looked up at me, her makeup smeared and her face blotchy. "What are you talking about?" she stammered. "I welcomed you. I defended you to my friends. I always treated you like my own daughter." "You called me ghetto behind my back, Beatrice," I said, dropping the final piece of the illusion. Beatrice froze. The loud sobbing instantly stopped. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as she realized I knew exactly what she had been saying when she thought I was not around. "Did you really think your country club friends were loyal to you?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You do not have real friends, Beatrice. You just have drinking partners who gossip the second you leave the table. They were more than happy to tell me how you complained about Julian marrying down. They told me how you laughed about securing the bag with the rich black girl from Atlanta. You did not see me as family. You saw me as a mark. You saw a successful black woman, and you thought I would be so desperate for your white validation that I would just hand over my wealth to your son." Beatrice opened her mouth to deny it, but the lie died in her throat. She knew I had her completely figured out. There was nowhere left for her to hide. The truth was out in the open, and it was suffocating her. "You thought you were the predator in this house." I continued, my tone steady and unforgiving. "You thought you could just plant 32 parasites in my company and quietly siphon away my father's legacy. You thought you were so much smarter than the diverse hires you pretended to tolerate. But you forgot one very important detail, Beatrice. I am the chief financial officer. I control the numbers. I see every single transaction. You were never pulling the strings. You were just dancing on the stage I built for you." "Alia, please." Beatrice tried one last time, her voice reduced to a pathetic whine. "I am an old woman. I have nothing left. Please show some mercy." "Mercy is for people who make honest mistakes," I replied, looking down at her crumpled form. "You committed calculated federal wire fraud. You stole millions of dollars from the people who opened their doors to you. Now you are just a liability. And in the corporate world, we liquidate our liabilities. I reached down and grabbed the edge of the heavy mahogany door. Your 5 days to vacate that historical mansion start right now, Beatrice, I said. If you and Chloe are not gone by Friday morning, the sheriff's department will physically remove you. Now get off my property. Beatrice slowly pushed herself up from the floor. She leaned heavily against the doorframe, looking like a hollow shell of the arrogant woman who had kicked that same door open just an hour ago. She did not say another word. She just turned around and stumbled down the front steps, dragging her feet across the concrete pathway. Chloe, who had finally stopped screaming in the living room, scrambled up from the floor. She looked terrified, avoiding my gaze completely as she hurried out the door to follow her mother into the dark street. They had arrived in Julian leased Porsche, expecting to leave as millionaires. Now they were walking away on foot with absolutely nowhere to go. I pushed the heavy front door shut and locked the deadbolt. The sharp click echoed through the empty foyer, bringing a profound sense of closure to the longest evening of my life. I stood there for a moment, letting the absolute silence of my home wash over me. The parasites were gone. The grifters had been escorted off my premises. My wealth, my home, and my peace were finally secure. I walked back into the kitchen and picked up my glass of bourbon. The ice had melted slightly, but the drink still tasted perfect. I took a slow sip, savoring the quiet victory. But the night was not quite over yet. I still had one more very important guest arriving, and unlike the last three, this one was actually invited. Headlights swept across the front windows of my living room. The low, powerful hum of a luxury engine announced the arrival of the only man I truly respected. It was time for the patriarch of Titan Global Logistics to see the results of our 4-year strategy. I set my glass down and walked slowly back toward the front of the house. Through the massive arched windows flanking my front door, I watched a sleek black Maybach glide smoothly up the long circular driveway. The heavy tires crunched softly against the gravel, coming to a perfect stop, right behind where the police cruisers had been parked just moments ago. The sheer size and pristine condition of the vehicle commanded absolute authority. This was not a leased sports car meant to impress strangers at a suburban country club. This was a vehicle bought and paid for in cash by a man who had built a logistics empire with his own 2 hands. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy mahogany door open, letting the cool night air wash over me once again. Beatrice and Chloe had not made it very far. They were still standing near the edge of my manicured lawn, huddled together in the dark. Chloe was shivering, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest, while Beatrice stared blankly down the street in the direction Julian had been taken. But the moment the Maybach pulled up, Beatrice's posture shifted. I watched her eyes widen as she recognized my father's license plate. In her twisted, desperate mind, she must have thought this was her final lifeline. She still believed in the old hierarchy, where a wealthy patriarch would surely step in to silence a rebellious, emotional woman. She thought my father would view my corporate takeover as a hysterical domestic dispute rather than a calculated business maneuver. The driver's side door of the Maybach opened, and my father stepped out into the night. Isaiah was a tall, broad-shouldered black man who carried himself with the quiet, terrifying grace of a predator who never had to raise his voice to be heard. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that fit his frame perfectly. There was no flashy jewelry and no desperate need for attention. His mere presence demanded respect. I had spent 40 years turning a single delivery truck into a billion-dollar supply chain network. He had dealt with ruthless competitors, corrupt politicians, and cutthroat unions. A weeping suburban socialite was absolutely nothing to him. Isaiah buttoned his suit jacket and began walking up the wide stone pathway toward my front porch. His face was a mask of pure calm. Beatrice saw him approaching and practically threw herself across the lawn. She stumbled over the expensive landscaping, her designer shoes sinking into the soft soil as she rushed to intercept him before he could reach the steps. "Isaiah, please," Beatrice cried out, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to talk some sense into your daughter. She has gone completely insane. She called the federal authorities on Julian. She liquidated his startup. She is trying to take my home away from me, Isaiah. She is destroying my entire family over a simple divorce settlement." My father did not slow his pace. He did not alter his stride, and he did not even look down at the frantic white woman trying to block his path to my door. He kept his eyes locked entirely on me as he ascended the front steps. Beatrice scrambled up the stairs behind him, panting and reaching out as if she wanted to grab his arm, but was too intimidated by his aura to actually make contact. You know how women get when they are emotional. Isaiah Beatrice pleaded, trying to play on what she assumed was a shared patriarchal understanding. Aaliyah is just hurt because Julian is leaving her. She is letting her heartbreak ruin our business relationship. You and I are the adults here, Isaiah. We are the heads of these families. You cannot let her tear down everything we built just to satisfy a petty grudge. Tell her to drop the foreclosure. Tell her to call off the FBI. You have to rein her in before she causes permanent damage to your corporate reputation. My father reached the top step and stopped right in front of me. The porch light cast a long shadow over his features. He stood there in his immaculate charcoal suit, looking completely unfazed by the woman sobbing and rambling just 2 feet behind him. He did not turn his head. He did not acknowledge Beatrice's existence in any way, shape, or form. He simply looked at me, his dark eyes reflecting the same quiet, ruthless intelligence that he had passed down to his only child. Is the trash taken out, CFO? My father asked, his voice, a deep, resonant rumble that completely overpowered Beatrice, frantic whining. I looked at the man who had taught me how to read balance sheets when I was 10 years old. I looked at the man who had warned me that people would always try to underestimate me because of my race and my gender. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. Every single piece of it, I replied, my voice steady and professional. The warehouses are clear. The federal indictments are in motion. The startup is fully liquidated and integrated into our holdings. The outstanding debt has been weaponized, and the eviction process is officially on the county ledger. Our supply chain is completely secure for the holiday quarter. My father nodded slowly, a profound sense of pride settling into the lines of his face. Good work, he said simply. Only then did Isaiah slowly turn his head to look over his shoulder at Beatrice. The older woman was standing on the top step, freezing in the night air, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. She had spent the last 4 years treating my father like a lucky token, looking down on him at our joint family dinners, making passive-aggressive comments about his background. She thought she was the aristocrat, and we were just the hired help who happened to strike it rich. My father looked at her from head to toe, his expression one of absolute undisguised disgust. I think you severely misunderstood the dynamic of my family. Beatrice, my father said, his voice cold enough to freeze the blood in her veins. You thought you were marrying your worthless son into a fortune you could manipulate. You thought because I am a father, I would somehow override my own blood to protect your fragile feelings. But you are looking at the chief financial officer of Titan Global Logistics. My daughter runs my empire. She is the architect of this entire operation. Beatrice took a trembling step backward, her hands clutching her chest as the last shred of her delusion finally evaporated. If my daughter says you belong in the gutter, my father continued, leaning slightly closer to her so she could feel the absolute finality of his words, then that is exactly where I will make sure you stay. Do not ever speak to me, do not ever look at me, and do not ever step foot near my family again. He turned his back on her, completely dismissing her very existence. He placed a warm, heavy hand on my shoulder and guided me back inside my beautiful home. We walked through the foyer together, leaving Beatrice standing alone on the porch, staring into the absolute ruin of her own life. I reached back and grabbed the heavy mahogany door. I did not offer Beatrice a final parting word or a victorious smirk. I simply pulled the door shut, locking the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. The sound echoed through the grand entryway, sealing off the outside world and leaving my father and me standing in the quiet sanctuary of the fortress we had protected. We walked into the kitchen, and my father took a seat at the marble island. He loosened his silk tie and let out a long breath, looking around the pristine room. I walked over to the liquor cabinet and pulled out 2 crystal glasses. I poured a generous measure of the expensive bourbon into each one and slid one across the counter to him. He picked up the glass and held it up in the air. To securing the legacy, my father said, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his stern features. To taking out the trash, I replied, clinking my glass against his. We drank in companionable silence, the warm burn of the bourbon settling in my chest. The 4-year-long nightmare of dealing with the Jackson family was officially over. They had tried to drain our wealth, exploit our kindness, and insult our heritage. Instead, they had unwittingly handed us complete ownership of everything they held dear. My father set his glass down and folded his hands on the counter. He looked at the scattered paperwork still sitting on the island, the federal indictments, the asset seizure orders, the foreclosure notices. You executed this flawlessly. Aliyah, he said, his tone shifting back to the professional rhythm we used in the boardroom. The board of directors is going to be extremely pleased with how you handled this transition. The dead weight has been excised, and our profit margins for the upcoming fiscal year are going to reflect the cleanup. I leaned against the counter, feeling the residual adrenaline slowly fading from my system, leaving behind a deep, profound sense of peace. I could finally breathe without feeling the toxic presence of Julian and his mother hovering over my shoulder. The house was quiet. The company was secure. My future was entirely my own. I am scheduling an emergency all-hands meeting for 9 tomorrow morning, I told my father. We need to address the corporate staff and ensure the middle management structure is stabilized. Now that the 32 fraudulent hires have been removed, we have to control the internal narrative before the press gets a hold of the federal raid. My father nodded in agreement. I will be there, he said. We will stand united on that stage. They need to see that the leadership of Titan Global is stronger than ever. I looked out the large living room windows toward the dark street outside. I knew Beatrice and Chloe were likely trudging down the road right now, calling whatever fair-weather friends they had left, begging for a couch to sleep on. I felt absolutely no pity for them. They had dug their own graves with their greed and their prejudice. They had tried to bury me, but they forgot I owned the shovel. I turned back to the kitchen, where my father was reviewing the asset seizure documents. Just as I poured myself another glass of water, I heard a frantic scuffling sound coming from the guest wing of the house. Chloe. I had almost forgotten she was still inside. While Beatrice was putting on her theatrical performance on the front porch, Chloe had slinked away, trying to use the chaos to her advantage. I set my glass down and walked quietly down the long hallway toward the guest bedroom she had tried to claim as her own. I stood in the doorway watching her. Chloe was in a state of absolute panic. She had pulled 4 massive designer suitcases from the closet and was desperately shoving everything she could get her hands on into the expensive leather bags. She was throwing in silk dresses, cashmere sweaters, and tossing a pile of luxury handbags onto the bed. She was crying hysterically, but her greed was clearly overriding her grief. She thought she could sneak out the back door with hundreds of thousands of dollars in luxury goods. She thought she could at least pawn the designer items to keep herself afloat while Julian sat in federal holding. I leaned against the doorframe and cleared my throat. Going somewhere, Chloe? I asked, my voice cutting through the sounds of her frantic packing. Chloe jumped, dropping a pair of designer heels onto the floor. She spun around, her face pale and streaked with mascara. Aliyah, please, she stammered, her eyes darting toward the window. I am just getting my things. I am leaving just like you wanted. I am not taking anything that belongs to you. These are my bags. Julian bought them for me. I walked slowly into the room, looking at the mountain of luxury goods piled on the bed. That is exactly the problem, Chloe, I said. Julian bought them for you. And do you know what card he used to buy that $30,000 bag you are clutching right now? Chloe swallowed hard, hugging the bag closer to her chest. He used his black card, she whispered defensively. He is my brother. He takes care of me. I used a corporate credit card tied directly to his fraudulent startup, I corrected her. He used the very same bank accounts that are currently frozen by the federal government for wire fraud and money laundering. Every single item in this room that your brother purchased for you was bought with stolen corporate funds. Chloe's eyes widened in terror as the reality of my words sank in. Therefore, I continued pacing slowly around the bed. All of these designer bags, all of these expensive clothes, and all of this jewelry are considered proceeds of a federal crime. If you walk out of my house with a single one of those bags, you are actively removing evidence from a federal investigation. You will be arrested for possessing stolen property and tampering with evidence." Chloe let out a choked sob. Her hands went limp, and the expensive handbag dropped from her grasp, tumbling onto the floor. "But I have nothing else," she cried, her voice rising in a desperate whine. "I do not have a job, Aaliyah. I do not have any money in my checking account. My fiancé was just arrested at the warehouse. He was supposed to take care of me. How am I supposed to survive?" I looked at her, feeling absolutely zero sympathy. For 4 years, Chloe had lived off my hard work. She had mocked my clothes, calling my professional suits too stiff, while she paraded around in luxury brands my company paid for. She had treated my home like a free hotel and my bank account like an endless ATM. "You are 28 years old, Chloe," I said, staring her down. "It is time you figure out how the real world works. You have zero job skills because you thought you could just ride your brother coattails forever. You thought you could marry a warehouse manager who was stealing from a black-owned business and live happily ever after on our dime. You thought you were so much better than the people actually doing the work." I stepped closer to her, forcing her to back up against the wall. "Leave the bags," I ordered, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You can walk out of here with the clothes on your back and the cheap sneakers you wore when you kicked my front door open. Everything else stays here for the forensic auditors to catalog." Chloe looked at the mountain of designer goods and then looked at me. She knew I was not bluffing. She knew if she tried to fight me, I would call Detective Rollins right back to my house. Defeated and completely broken, Chloe grabbed her cheap denim jacket from the chair and shuffled toward the bedroom door. I followed her down the hallway, marching her straight to the front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled it open. The night air was cold and the street was dark. Beatrice was nowhere to be seen, likely wandering down the road trying to find a cell phone signal to call her fair weather friends. "Get out, Chloe," I said. She stepped out onto the porch, shivering as the cold wind hit her. She did not look back. She just wrapped her denim jacket tightly around her body and started walking down the long driveway with absolutely nothing to her name. I closed the door and locked it for the final time. The trash was officially taken out. The next morning, the sun rose over Atlanta, bringing with it a profound sense of clarity and renewal. I woke up early, feeling lighter than I had in years. I showered, dressed in my sharpest tailored navy blue power suit, and drove my own personal car down the bustling highway toward the Titan Global Logistics corporate headquarters. When I walked through the glass double doors of the main lobby, the atmosphere was completely electric. Word had already spread through the building. The removal of the 32 toxic, incompetent managers had happened overnight. The federal raids on the Midwest distribution centers were the talk of the entire logistics industry. I walked past the front desk, and the security guards gave me respectful nods. As I made my way through the operational floors, I could actually feel the shift in the company culture. For 4 years, the hard-working employees, the diligent black and brown staff members, and the genuinely qualified white employees had suffered under the oppressive, arrogant rule of Beatrice-planted relatives. They had been forced to cover for the mistakes of lazy regional managers. They had been written up for reporting missing inventory. They had endured toxic microaggressions from people who barely knew how to operate the logistics software. Now all 32 of those parasites were gone. The heavy, dark cloud that had been suffocating our corporate culture was completely lifted. I saw employees smiling, chatting openly at the water coolers, and moving with a renewed sense of purpose. Morale had instantly skyrocketed. I walked into the executive boardroom, where my father Isaiah was already waiting. The long mahogany table was surrounded by our senior vice presidents, our legal team, and our regional directors. When I entered the room, every single person stood up. There was no polite corporate golf clapping or forced smiles. There was genuine, profound respect. I took my seat at the head of the table next to my father. We initiated an emergency all-hands virtual meeting, broadcasting to every single warehouse, distribution center, and corporate office under the Titan Global umbrella. I looked directly into the camera lens. "Good morning, everyone," I began, my voice projecting calm, absolute authority. "As many of you are aware, there was a significant restructuring within our middle management and Midwest operations late last night. 32 individuals were terminated and remanded into federal custody for engaging in a coordinated embezzlement scheme against this company. I paused, letting the weight of the statement settle across the thousands of employees watching. I know many of you have carried the burden of their incompetence for a very long time, I continued. I know you worked overtime to fix their deliberate mistakes. I want to personally thank every single employee who maintained the integrity of this company while my team and I built the federal case required to remove them. The ROT has been completely cut out. From this day forward, Titan Global Logistics operates strictly on merit, hard work, and excellence. And to show our appreciation, every employee who worked under those 32 individuals will be receiving a substantial retention bonus in their next paycheck. The response was immediate and overwhelming. I could see the regional directors in the boardroom nodding their approval. My father looked at me with a quiet, fierce pride that spoke volumes. But the internal victory was only half the battle. We still had to deal with the external fallout. In the corporate world, a massive federal raid on your distribution centers could easily trigger a public relations nightmare. It could spook investors, panic clients, and cause valuations to plummet. But I had anticipated the market reaction perfectly. I had already instructed our public relations team to release a comprehensive transparency report to the financial news networks simultaneously with the all-hands meeting. Instead of a terrible scandal, tanking our stock, the news of the corruption bust hit the industry like a masterclass in corporate governance. The financial news tickers across major networks were flashing our company name. The headlines were not about a black-owned business failing. The headlines were about a brilliant internal audit that dismantled a multi-million-dollar corporate espionage ring. The transparency and decisive action we showed caused our corporate valuation to absolutely skyrocket. Major shipping clients who had previously been hesitant to sign long-term contracts because of the Midwest delays suddenly flooded our legal department with renewal requests. They saw that Titan Global Logistics was run by a financial team that did not tolerate a single ounce of corruption regardless of who was involved. By early afternoon, my phone was ringing off the hook with interview requests from top-tier financial magazines and business networks. They all wanted to speak to the chief financial officer, who had orchestrated the flawless takedown of a massive fraud ring while simultaneously liquidating the shell company that tried to wash the money. I was lauded across the industry as a ruthless, brilliant financial strategist. The business world recognized that I was not just the daughter of the founder. I was the true strategic power behind the throne of Titan Global. I had protected my father's legacy and multiplied our market value in a single calculated stroke. I sat in my corner office looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. My desk was clear. My inbox was full of congratulations from industry titans. The dark, heavy chapter of my marriage to Julian was officially closed. I had survived the gaslighting, the racism, and the manipulation. I had taken the absolute worst they had to throw at me, and I had turned it into pure, unadulterated power. 6 months passed since that defining morning in my office. The corporate world moves incredibly fast, but the federal justice system moves at its own methodical pace. When the trial finally began, the air in the downtown Atlanta federal courthouse was thick with anticipation. I sat in the back row of the gallery wearing a perfectly tailored ivory suit. I was completely unbothered, simply there as an observer to the final act of a play I had meticulously written. The prosecution had built an airtight case using the forensic accounting reports I provided. Every single fraudulent transaction had been cataloged, leaving them zero room to hide. But the real entertainment did not come from the federal prosecutors. It came from the defendants themselves. When you trap greedy, entitled people in a corner, their loyalty to one another evaporates instantly. Julian took the stand on the third day of the trial. I was wearing an ill-fitting gray suit, looking nothing like the arrogant tech founder he once pretended to be. His skin was pale and his hands shook as he adjusted the microphone. Desperate to secure a lighter sentence, Julian did exactly what a coward does. He turned on his own mother. I watched his lips move as he testified under oath that Beatrice had orchestrated the entire embezzlement ring from the very beginning. He told the jury that she had pressured him into accepting the stolen seed money. He painted himself as a naive son who was emotionally manipulated by a domineering mother. He literally cried on the witness stand, hoping the jury would take pity on him and spare him from the maximum sentence. He claimed Beatrice was the true mastermind behind planting the 32 employees in my father company. Beatrice was sitting at the defense table, and I watched her completely lose her mind. The pristine suburban facade shattered into a million pieces right there in open court. She jumped up from her chair, screaming at Julian, calling him a liar and a traitor. She yelled to the judge that Julian was a degenerate who had begged her to steal the money to fund his pathetic lifestyle. The judge had to bang his gavel repeatedly, threatening to hold her in contempt as the bailiffs forced her back into her seat. It was a spectacular display of self-destruction. They were doing the prosecutor's job for them, tearing each other apart in front of a horrified jury. The wealthy white family that had once looked down on me, calling me ghetto and unrefined, was now putting on the most shameful, trashy spectacle the federal courthouse had ever seen. I sat quietly in my ivory suit, crossing my legs and resting my hands in my lap. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just watched them burn their own legacy to the ground, knowing I had been the one to strike the match and walk away untouched by their fire. The swift and decisive nature of the verdict surprised absolutely no one. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. When the sentencing hearing arrived a few weeks later, the courtroom was dead silent. The judge looked down from the bench with zero leniency. He sentenced Julian to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy and wire fraud. He then turned his attention to Beatrice, citing her egregious manipulation and theft, sentencing her to 5 full years behind bars. As the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom closed behind them, their elite status officially died. Their carefully constructed facade of superiority was completely shattered, leaving them with nothing but the grim reality of their own consequences. But the final nail in their coffin was not the prison sentence. It was the absolute loss of their material reality. Before Beatrice was required to report to federal prison to begin serving her time, the bank finalized the foreclosure on her beloved generational mansion. The asset transfer had been processed by Titan Global Logistics, and the eviction was scheduled and executed. I decided to take a drive out to the suburbs that afternoon. I drove my car slowly down the familiar tree-lined street where Beatrice had once hosted her lavish country club mixers. I parked a safe distance away and watched through my tinted windows. A cheap rusted U-Haul truck was parked in the circular driveway. Beatrice and Chloe were walking back and forth, carrying out what little belongings they had been legally allowed to keep. They were hauling cheap cardboard boxes and garbage bags full of clothes. There were no designer suitcases or luxury moving services. There was only the harsh truth of their new existence. They looked exhausted and utterly defeated. I watched Chloe struggle to lift a heavy box into the back of the rental truck, her face red and streaked with tears. Beatrice looked small and frail, stripped of the expensive jewelry and tailored dresses that used to give her so much confidence. I knew where they were heading, with zero credit and no assets. Chloe had managed to secure a weekly rate at a cheap rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. That was where they would stay until Beatrice reported to prison, leaving Chloe completely alone to navigate a world she had never actually worked a day in. I sat in my car for a long time, just watching them load the final garbage bag into the truck. I did not roll down my window. I did not honk my horn or shout any parting insults. I did not need to gloat, because reality was already delivering a punishment far worse than any words I could offer. As they pulled out of the driveway, leaving their historical estate behind, forever, I felt the absolute closure of a closed chapter. I put my car in drive and drove away from the suburbs, heading back toward the city, where my true legacy was waiting for me. I returned to the corporate headquarters the following Monday morning with a renewed sense of absolute purpose. The air in the executive suite felt lighter and more dynamic than it had in years. My father Isaiah called a special meeting with the board of directors and the entire senior executive team. He stood at the head of the long mahogany table, looking around the room with a profound sense of quiet pride. He announced that after 40 years of building Titan Global Logistics from a single delivery truck into a multi-billion-dollar supply chain empire, it was officially time for him to step down. He did not look for an external candidate or a corporate outsider to take the reins. He looked directly at me. My father officially named me the new chief executive officer of the company. The transition of power was seamless, and the entire boardroom erupted into genuine applause. To celebrate this monumental milestone and to publicly re-establish our unshakable family legacy, we hosted a grand gala in downtown Atlanta the following month. It was a spectacular evening entirely dedicated to Black excellence and the proper execution of generational wealth. The luxury ballroom was filled with industry leaders, local community advocates, and the loyal, hardworking employees who had stood by our side during the most turbulent times. I wore a stunning custom emerald green gown and stood on the beautifully illuminated stage looking out at a sea of incredibly supportive faces. I took the microphone and made an announcement that would completely define my new era of leadership. I had taken the millions of dollars in funds recovered from the dismantled embezzlement ring and the liquidated assets of my former husband and his fake startup and funneled them directly into a powerful new initiative. I proudly launched a massive comprehensive mentorship and scholarship program designed specifically for young women of color pursuing ambitious careers in science, technology, engineering, finance, and supply chain management. I wanted to ensure that the door remained wide open for those who truly earned their place through relentless hard work and undeniable brilliance. I refused to let toxic nepotism or lazy entitlement ever dictate the future of our company or our industry again. My goal was to equip young women with the tools they needed to protect themselves and their assets in corporate spaces. The enormous room echoed with thunderous applause as I promised to dedicate my tenure to empowering the next generation of fierce independent leaders. It was the absolute perfect triumph, turning a bitter, calculated betrayal into a solid foundation of hope and lasting opportunity. Later that night, after the spectacular gala concluded, I returned to my beautiful, quiet home in the upscale Buckhead neighborhood. I kicked off my heels and walked out onto my spacious private balcony, letting the cool, refreshing evening breeze wash over my tired but triumphant body. I looked out at the peaceful, manicured streets below, feeling a deep and profound sense of absolute peace settling into my bones. There was no manipulative man pacing in my kitchen, trying to gaslight me out of my hard-earned equity. There were no toxic elitist family members sitting in my living room, plotting to drain my bank accounts or disrespect my cultural heritage. There were absolutely no parasites hiding in the shadows of my monumental success. The massive house was completely silent, and it was undeniably the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I stood there, resting my hands on the cool metal railing, looking up at the dark, clear night sky. I took a moment to truly reflect on the brutal but entirely necessary journey of the past year. I learned that you must always know your absolute, undeniable worth, and you must never ever negotiate your value just to make someone else feel comfortable in your presence. I learned the vital, critical importance of setting ironclad boundaries, especially when dealing with people who view your generosity and kindness as a simple weakness to be exploited. We spend so much of our lives trying to be accommodating and polite that we sometimes forget we are the ones who hold the heavy iron keys to our own kingdoms. You must never let anyone dim your radiant light or attempt to steal the generational legacy you and your family bled to build from the ground up. When greedy, opportunistic people show you their true nature, you have to believe them the very first time, and you must act with swift, unrelenting precision to cut them out of your orbit. You must vigorously protect your peace, your financial wealth, and your internal spirit at all absolute costs. The corporate world and the people around you will always try to test your established boundaries, but you are the only one who has the power to enforce them. I smiled a genuine warm smile as I took a deep, cleansing breath of the crisp night air, feeling completely grounded in my absolute power and my unshakable truth. They thought they were marrying into a fortune they could manipulate. They didn't realize they were marrying into a fortress they couldn't breach. My name is Aaliyah, and my divorce didn't break me, it set me free. The ultimate lesson is that you must never compromise your personal legacy to accommodate toxic, entitled people. This story teaches us that setting ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but vital protection. When manipulative individuals view your kindness as a weakness and attempt to exploit your success, the most powerful response is to silently build your fortress and let their own greed orchestrate their massive downfall. True empowerment comes from recognizing your unwavering worth and ruthlessly removing those who steal your peace. Have you ever drawn a hard line with manipulative relatives? Share your story below with us.